I'm sitting in this cold courtroom, my hands trembling as I stare at the papers in front of me. 47 years of marriage, and I thought I knew everything about the man sitting across from me. But the words coming from my lawyer's mouth sound like they're from another planet. Your Honor, my client is the rightful owner of a $1.2 million mansion in Rosedale that she never knew existed. The judge looks just as confused as I feel. Richard's face goes completely white. For the first time in 20 years, I see genuine fear in his eyes instead of that cold indifference I've grown so used to. A mansion? What mansion? My heart is pounding so hard I can barely hear Margaret, my lawyer, explaining how this house was purchased entirely with funds stolen from my accounts. Stolen from me by my own husband. I look at Richard, this man I've shared a bed with for nearly 5 decades, and I don't recognize him anymore. The expensive suit he's wearing, that gold watch I never questioned, the confident smirk that's been replaced by panic. How did I miss all of this? The young blonde sitting behind him, Amanda, shifts uncomfortably. She's probably half my age, wearing jewelry that costs more than my monthly grocery budget. I should have known when he started coming home smelling like expensive perfume. But this isn't just about another woman. This is about a house, a mansion, built with my money while I've been clipping coupons and buying generic brands for the past 2 decades. As the judge calls for a recess, I realize this is just the beginning of a story that's going to change everything I thought I knew about my life. Stay tuned, because what I'm about to tell you is a story unlike any other that people share on the internet. Before continuing, if this story is touching your heart, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Don't forget to ring the notification bell, because every day I'm bringing you stories of women who turn their deepest pain into a new good way of living their lives. To understand how I ended up in that courtroom, I need to take you back to the beginning, back when Richard and I were young and in love, when 47 years stretched ahead of us like an endless summer. We met in 1976 at a community dance in Toronto. I was 21, working as a secretary at a small accounting firm, and he was this charming 23-year-old construction worker with big dreams and an even bigger smile. He promised me the world, and foolishly, I believed him. Our wedding was simple. My dress was borrowed from my sister, and we had the reception in my parents' church basement. But I was happy. We rented a tiny apartment above a bakery, and the smell of fresh bread would wake us up every morning. Those were the golden days, when every struggle felt like an adventure we were facing together. For the first 20 years, we were a team. I worked full-time while Richard bounced between construction jobs. When he decided to start his own contracting business, I supported him completely. I took on evening bookkeeping work to help fund his equipment. I remember sitting at our kitchen table until midnight, balancing ledgers under that flickering fluorescent light, my eyes burning from strain. When business was slow, I picked up weekend shifts at a local diner. My feet would ache so badly that I'd soak them in salt water every night, but I never complained. This was what you did for the person you loved. This was what marriage meant. I handled all our finances because Richard said numbers made his head spin. Every paycheck, every bill, every decision about our modest savings account went through me. I was proud of how carefully I managed our money. I could stretch a dollar further than anyone I knew. I'd spend hours comparing grocery store flyers, cutting coupons, buying day-old bread to save 50 cents. We lived in the same house for 30 years. A modest 2-story home with 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. I painted every room myself, sewed our curtains by hand, and grew vegetables in the backyard to save on groceries. That house was my pride and joy, filled with furniture I'd refinished myself and decorations I'd crafted during long winter evenings. But somewhere around 1996, when we'd been married 20 years, something changed. Richard started working longer hours. At first, I was proud of his dedication. The construction business was picking up, and he said he was landing bigger contracts. He'd come home exhausted, barely speaking to me, collapsing into his recliner with a beer and the remote control. Then came the mood swings. The man who once brought me wildflowers from construction sites started snapping at me for leaving dishes in the sink. The husband who used to rub my shoulders after my long shifts at the diner began treating me like I was invisible. I told myself it was stress. Building a business was hard work. I just needed to be more supportive, more understanding. So I took on more hours at the diner. When that wasn't enough, I started cleaning offices in the early mornings before my regular job. I'd wake up at 4 a.m., scrub toilets and vacuum floors, then rush home to shower and get to the accounting firm by 8. By evening, I was so exhausted I could barely stand, but Richard needed my support. The verbal abuse started slowly. Little comments about my appearance, my cooking, my intelligence. You're getting old. You don't understand business. Why can't you make a decent meal anymore? I absorbed each cruel word like a sponge, believing somehow that I deserved them. I started walking on eggshells in my own home. I'd choose my words carefully, anticipating his reactions. I stopped talking about my day because he'd roll his eyes or make cutting remarks. I stopped asking about his work because he'd accuse me of being nosy or controlling. The financial control became absolute. Even though I was the one managing our money, Richard started questioning every purchase. Why did you buy name brand coffee? Do you really need new work shoes? Can't you fix that old coat instead of buying a new one? Meanwhile, I noticed small changes I couldn't explain. His clothes seemed newer, better quality. He had a cell phone when I was still asking to use the neighbor's landline for important calls. He started going out for drinks with the guys several times a week, always coming home late with alcohol on his breath and irritation in his voice. I worked myself to the bone for 27 years, believing that my sacrifice meant something. Every dollar I earned went into our joint account. Every penny I saved was for our future together. I dreamed of the day we could retire, maybe travel a little, enjoy the fruits of all this hard work. I never questioned the bank statements because Richard said he'd started handling the investment side of our finances. You just worry about the day-to-day stuff, he'd say. I've got the big picture covered. What a fool I was. I gave him the best years of my life. I gave him my youth, my energy, my unwavering loyalty. I worked multiple jobs to support his dreams while sacrificing my own. I endured his increasingly cruel treatment because I believed that's what commitment meant. All those nights I fell asleep exhausted on the couch, still in my work uniform. All those mornings I counted out exact change for groceries, while he somehow had money for expensive lunches and nights out. All those years I wore the same winter coat while he bought himself new tools and gadgets. I was building our future, one sacrifice at a time. But what I didn't know was that he was building something entirely different, something that didn't include me at all. The woman who walked into that divorce lawyer's office was tired, broken, and 50 pounds lighter than she'd been in her 20s. Years of stress and overwork had taken their toll, but I still believed that somehow we could fix this marriage. I had no idea that the man I devoted my life to had been systematically stealing from me for decades. The beginning of the end started with a phone call I was never supposed to receive. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was getting ready for work when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional, polite, but confused. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Jennifer from Royal Bank. We're calling about the late payment on your investment property mortgage. The Rosedale property? We haven't received this month's payment," and I stopped her right there. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. We don't have an investment property." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. "Ma'am, according to our records, you and your husband Richard Patterson own a property at 47 Elmwood Manor Drive. The mortgage is in both your names, and you're listed as the primary contact for." My hands started shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone. "That's impossible. I would know if we owned another property." After I hung up, I sat on our old couch for 20 minutes, staring at the wall. Richard had already left for work, and the house felt hollow around me. 47 years of marriage, and I was discovering we owned property I'd never heard of. I called in sick to work for the first time in 15 years. The first stop was the bank. Jennifer, a kind woman about my daughter's age, pulled up our account information with obvious discomfort. What she showed me made my world tilt sideways. There weren't just accounts I didn't know about. There were investment portfolios, certificates of deposit, and yes, a mortgage on a $1.2 million property in one of Toronto's most exclusive neighborhoods. "Mrs. Patterson, these accounts show regular transfers from your joint checking account. Large amounts, thousands of dollars every month for the past 20 years. I stared at the computer screen, watching numbers that didn't make sense dance before my eyes. Our joint account, the one where I deposited every paycheck from my 3 jobs, had been systematically drained. Money I thought was going to our modest savings had been funneled into investments I'd never approved. How is this possible? I never signed anything for this property." Jennifer's face was grim as she pulled up more documents. "Actually, Mum, your signature is on file for all of these accounts. See here." The signature looked like mine, but I knew with absolute certainty that I'd never signed these papers. My hands were trembling as I traced the familiar loops and curves of what appeared to be my own handwriting. "I need copies of everything," I whispered. The drive to 47 Elmwood Manor Drive felt like traveling to another planet. The GPS led me through neighborhoods I'd only seen in magazines. Massive houses set back on manicured lawns, luxury cars in circular driveways, gates and security systems that screamed wealth. When I found the address, I sat in my 15-year-old Honda and stared at a house that belonged in a movie. 6 bedrooms, according to the bank documents. 3-car garage, swimming pool, garden that probably cost more to maintain than I made in a month. And somehow, according to these papers, I owned it. I was working up the courage to knock on the door when it opened, and my life shattered completely. Richard walked out, wearing clothes I'd never seen before. Expensive clothes. Behind him was a young blonde woman in a silk robe, laughing at something he'd said. They were holding hands. I watched my husband of 47 years kiss this girl who could have been his granddaughter, right there on the steps of a mansion I'd apparently been paying for without knowing it. They got into a BMW I'd never seen before and drove away, never noticing the broken woman sitting in the old Honda across the street. Before we continue, make sure to like this video and subscribe. With your support, we can keep bringing more stories from powerful women that touch the heart of all of us. I drove home in a daze, but instead of confronting Richard immediately, something inside me had shifted. For the first time in 27 years, I wasn't going to be the naive wife who believed whatever story he told me. I was going to find out the truth. I started with our home office, a small room where Richard kept his business files. For years, he'd told me this room was off limits because it contained sensitive client information. I'd respected that boundary like I'd respected all his boundaries. But not anymore. Hidden behind his business files, I found a folder marked personal investments. Inside were documents that made me physically sick. Bank statements showing regular transfers of my earnings into accounts I'd never seen. Purchase agreements for luxury items I'd never heard of. Credit card statements for restaurants I'd never been to. Jewelry I'd never received. Trips I'd never taken. The girl's name was Amanda Sterling, 28 years old. The credit card statements showed purchases at high-end boutiques, spa treatments, expensive hotels. Richard had been financing an entire second life with money I'd earned scrubbing office floors at 4 in the morning. But the worst was yet to come. I found a letter, handwritten, from Amanda to Richard. The date was just 3 months ago. Darling, I can't wait until you're finally free of that old woman. I know the divorce will be messy, but think about our future together in the Elmwood house. Maybe we can start trying for a baby soon. I love you so much. AA baby. This girl wanted to have Richard's baby in the house I'd been unknowingly paying for. The room started spinning. I had to sit down on the floor, surrounded by evidence of a betrayal so complete it took my breath away. Then I found the security camera footage. Richard had installed cameras around the Elmwood property, and apparently, he'd been careless with where he stored the files. There it was, on his computer. Months of footage showing him living this double life. Him and Amanda hosting parties, swimming in the pool, entertaining other couples I didn't recognize. In one video, dated just 2 weeks ago, I watched Amanda show off an engagement ring to a group of friends. A ring that probably cost more than I made in a year. He was planning to marry her. That's when everything clicked into place. The cruel behavior, the financial secrecy, the emotional distance. He hadn't just been cheating on me. He'd been systematically destroying our marriage while building a new life with my money. I copied everything onto a flash drive, replaced the files exactly as I'd found them, and left the office. When Richard came home that night, I was sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking exactly like the tired, unsuspecting wife he left that morning. He kissed my forehead and complained about his day while I nodded and made sympathetic sounds. Inside, I was screaming. That night, I lay awake next to a man who was planning to divorce me and marry his pregnant girlfriend in a house I'd been paying for. A man who'd been forging my signature and stealing my money for 20 years. But for the first time in decades, I wasn't powerless. The next morning, I called Margaret Thompson, the best divorce attorney in Toronto. When I told her what I'd discovered, even this experienced lawyer was shocked. "This isn't just adultery," she said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "This is financial abuse on a massive scale. We're going to take him for everything he's worth. And since he bought that house with your money, you own it." The papers were filed that afternoon. Richard was served at the Elmwood house, in front of Amanda and their friends. According to my neighbor David, who happened to be driving by, the shouting could be heard from the street. Richard came home that night like a man possessed. I was sitting in my usual spot at the kitchen table, pretending to read a magazine, when he burst through the door. His face was red with rage, veins bulging in his neck, and for a moment I was genuinely afraid of what he might do. "What the hell do you think you're playing at?" he shouted, throwing the divorce papers on the table so hard they scattered across the floor. I looked up at him calmly, though my heart was racing. "I think I'm finally standing up for myself." "Standing up for yourself? You crazy old woman. You have no idea what you're messing with. You can't just accuse me of stealing. That money was mine too. Money from my 3 jobs. Richard? Money I earned while you were playing house with your girlfriend?" His face went pale. He hadn't expected me to know about Amanda. "I don't know what lies someone's been filling your head with, but nobody filled my head with anything." I stood up slowly, pulling the flash drive from my pocket. I found everything myself. The bank accounts, the forged signatures, the house, Amanda. All of it. The change in his expression was terrifying. The mask of righteous indignation slipped away, replaced by something cold and calculating. This was the real Richard, the one I'd been living with for 20 years without recognizing him. "You went through my private files." "Your private files?" "Richard, we've been married for 47 years. Those weren't your private files. They were evidence of 20 years of theft." He started pacing around the kitchen like a caged animal. "You don't understand business. You never did. Those investments were for our future." "Our future? Or your future with Amanda?" The silence stretched between us. I could see his mind working, trying to figure out how much I actually knew. "She's nothing. Just a distraction. You're making a huge mistake here. A distraction that you bought $1 million house for? A distraction you're planning to marry and have children with?" Now he looked genuinely shocked. "How could you possibly? The security cameras. Richard, you recorded everything." For the first time in 20 years, I watched my husband crumble. He slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he mumbled. "How was it supposed to happen? Were you just going to divorce me and take everything? Leave me with nothing after 47 years? He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that chilled me to the bone. "You would have been fine. You're tough. You always land on your feet." "Tough?" I laughed bitterly. "Richard, I've been working myself to death for decades to support what I thought was our life together, while you've been living like a king on my money." "Our money," he corrected automatically. "No, my money. Money I earned at 4 in the morning cleaning offices. Money I made serving coffee to people who looked down on me. Money I saved by buying day-old bread and wearing the same winter coat for 10 years. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The same clock I'd wound every morning for 30 years. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "I want what's mine." The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, document reviews, and discoveries that kept getting worse. Margaret, my lawyer, was like a bloodhound, uncovering years of financial deception that even I hadn't suspected. There weren't just the investment accounts and the house. Richard had been living an entirely separate financial life. Credit cards I'd never seen, a boat docked at the marina, expensive watches, artwork, even a vacation property in Florida that he'd been visiting with Amanda twice a year. The total value of assets purchased with your money is approaching $3 million. Margaret told me during one of our meetings. This is one of the most comprehensive cases of financial abuse I'd ever seen. But Richard wasn't going down without a fight. He hired his own lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit who tried to paint me as a vengeful ex-wife, making false accusations. They claimed the investments were legitimate business decisions made with marital funds. They said Richard had every right to manage our money as he saw fit. The preliminary hearings were brutal. Richard's lawyer tried to make me look incompetent, suggesting that I was too naive to understand complex financial matters. He questioned my memory, my intelligence, even my mental health. "Mrs. Patterson, isn't it true that you've never shown interest in investments or business decisions throughout your marriage?" "That's because my husband told me he was handling those matters." while I focused on earning the money to fund them. But you never asked questions about where your money was going. I trusted my husband. I thought that's what marriage meant. So you admit you were willfully ignorant of your family's financial situation? Margaret objected, but the damage was done. They were trying to make my trust look like stupidity, my loyalty look like negligence. But then we got to the courtroom, and everything changed. The hearing was supposed to be routine, just another step in the process. But Margaret had been busy. She'd subpoenaed Richard's business records, his personal accounts, even his phone records. Your Honor, Margaret began, I'd like to present evidence that will clearly demonstrate the systematic theft of my clients' earnings over a period of 20 years. She started with the bank records, projecting them onto a screen for everyone to see. Month after month, year after year, transfers from our joint account into investment funds that only Richard controlled. These transfers represent money earned by Mrs. Patterson through her employment at 3 separate jobs. Money that was supposed to be going into their shared savings, but was instead being diverted into accounts she knew nothing about. Then came the property records. The house, the boat, the vacation condo, all purchased with money I'd earned, all titled in ways that would have left me with nothing in a divorce. This property at 47 Elmwood Manor Drive was purchased entirely with funds transferred from Mrs. Patterson's earnings. The down payment, the mortgage payments, even the furniture and renovations, all paid for with money she earned while her husband told her they couldn't afford a new winter coat. The judge was taking notes, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. But the moment that changed everything was when Margaret played the security camera footage. Your Honor, I'd like to show the court exactly how Mr. Patterson was living while his wife worked 3 jobs to support what she believed was their modest lifestyle. The video showed Richard and Amanda hosting elaborate dinner parties at the Elmwood house. Expensive wine, catered food, guests arriving in luxury cars. Richard was wearing a watch that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. Then came the audio from a party just 2 months ago. Richard, you're such a genius, one of his friends was saying. Getting your wife to pay for all this while she has no idea. And she's still working 3 jobs? Richard's laughter was clear and cruel. She's always been good at working hard and not asking questions. It's perfect, really. I get to live like this, and she gets to feel useful. But what happens when you divorce her? She'll get the house we actually live in and half of what she thinks we have. This place, the boat, the investments. She doesn't even know they exist. The courtroom was dead silent. Even Richard's lawyer looked stunned. I watched my husband of 47 years sit there with his head down, unable to deny his own recorded words. Furthermore, Your Honor, Margaret continued, we have evidence that Mr. Patterson has been forging his wife's signature on financial documents for years. She presented the signature analysis, showing clear differences between my actual signature and the ones on the investment accounts. And finally, we have documentation showing that Mr. Patterson was planning to divorce Mrs. Patterson and marry his girlfriend, who is currently pregnant with his child, all while continuing to live in the house Mrs. Patterson unknowingly purchased and maintained. The judge called for a brief recess, but I could see in his face that the case was over. When we returned, Richard tried one last desperate move. Your Honor, my wife is making this sound worse than it is. I was trying to secure our future. She never would have agreed to these investments if I'd asked her directly. Mr. Patterson, the judge said sternly, are you admitting that you knowingly made financial decisions without your wife's knowledge or consent? I was protecting her from having to worry about these matters. By forging her signature and stealing her money? Richard had no answer. The gavel came down like thunder. I find clear evidence of financial abuse, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Mrs. Patterson is awarded full ownership of the Elmwood Manor property, along with all other assets purchased with her earnings. Mr. Patterson, you will also be responsible for substantial damages and legal fees. 47 years of marriage ended with that single bang of the gavel. As we walked out of the courtroom, I saw Amanda waiting in the hallway, her hand protectively over her pregnant belly. When she saw Richard's face, she knew everything had changed. What happened? She asked frantically. Richard didn't even look at her as he walked past. His dream of keeping both his old life and his new one had just crumbled to dust. For the first time in 20 years, I walked out of a room feeling like I'd won something. The keys to 47 Elmwood Manor Drive felt heavy in my hands as I stood on the front steps of what was now legally my home. 3 weeks had passed since the court ruling, and I was finally ready to see what I'd actually been paying for all these years. Margaret had arranged for Richard and Amanda to remove their personal belongings under supervised conditions. They were gone now, along with their expensive furniture and designer clothes. But the house remained. My house. I opened the front door and stepped into a marble foyer that was bigger than my old kitchen. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they made me dizzy. The living room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens. That probably cost more to maintain than my old grocery budget. Every room told the story of a life I'd financed but never lived. The master bedroom had a walk-in closet filled with empty hangers, where Amanda's designer clothes had hung. The bathroom had a marble bathtub big enough for two people, with gold fixtures that gleamed in the afternoon light. I found myself in the kitchen, running my hands over granite countertops that were probably worth more than my old car. This was where Richard had cooked romantic dinners for his girlfriend, while I ate leftovers from the diner where I worked. But instead of anger, I felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in decades, I was standing in a space that was completely mine. No one could tell me what to do here, how to spend my money, or whether I deserved nice things. After 47 years of making myself smaller to accommodate someone else's ego, I was finally free to be myself. My neighbor David helped me move my things from the old house. He'd been the one to provide crucial testimony about Richard's comings and goings, and his quiet support had meant everything during those dark weeks of discovery. "You know," he said as we carried my grandmother's antique dresser into the master bedroom, "I always wondered how a construction worker could afford to houses. Should have said something years ago. It's not your fault, David. We all believed what we wanted to believe. The truth was, there had been signs everywhere if I'd been brave enough to see them. But when you love someone, you make excuses. You rationalize. You convince yourself that the red flags are just coincidences." Margaret stopped by a few days later with the final paperwork. The divorce was complete. All assets had been transferred, and Richard was facing potential criminal charges for the forged signatures. "How are you adjusting?" she asked as we sat in my new living room, drinking tea from china cups that had probably cost more than my weekly paycheck at the diner. "It's surreal," I admitted. "Sometimes I wake up and forget where I am, but I'm not angry anymore." "Is that strange?" "Not at all. You've reclaimed your power. That's healing." She was right. The woman who had walked into that divorce lawyer's office 6 months ago was broken, defeated, convinced she deserved the crumbs of life. But the woman sitting in this beautiful house was different, stronger, clearer about her own worth. I started making changes immediately. The first thing I did was donate most of the expensive furniture. I didn't need reminders of Richard and Amanda's life together. Instead, I moved in my own belongings, the pieces I'd collected and treasured over the years. My grandmother's rocking chair looked perfect by the bay window. The quilt I'd sewn by hand added warmth to the stark master bedroom. I hired a housekeeper, something I'd never imagined doing in my old life. Maria was a kind woman about my age who'd been cleaning houses for 30 years. When I told her my story, she hugged me like an old friend. "Mija," she said, "you deserve to be taken care of for once." The financial settlement had left me more secure than I'd ever dreamed possible. All those years of secret investments, funded by my money, were now mine. I could finally retire from the 3 jobs that had worn my body down. I could travel, take classes, maybe even date again someday. But the most healing thing was the garden. The backyard was an acre of professionally landscaped perfection, but it felt cold and unwelcoming. So I started digging. I planted tomatoes where exotic orchids had been. I put in herbs and flowers, vegetables and fruit trees. My hands, scarred from decades of hard work, felt at home in the soil. One afternoon, while I was planting roses near the back fence, my phone rang. It was Richard. "I want to talk," he said without preamble. "We don't have anything to talk about. Richard, please. Just 5 minutes. I need you to understand." "Understand what?" "That you stole from me for 20 years? That you made me feel worthless while you lived like a king on my money?" There was silence on the other end. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered. "I know you are. But sorry doesn't give me back 20 years of my life." I hung up and went back to my roses. 3 months later, I got word that Amanda had left Richard. Apparently, living in a modest apartment on a construction worker's salary wasn't quite the lifestyle she'd signed up for. Richard was alone now, facing bankruptcy and possible jail time. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, just sadness for all the years we'd wasted, all the happiness we could have shared if he'd been content with what we actually had, instead of stealing to create something we couldn't afford. David stopped by one evening as I was watering my garden. The sun was setting behind the old oak tree, casting golden light across the vegetables I'd planted where Richard's pool used to be. "You look different," he said. "How so?" "Peaceful, like you've finally found where you belong." He was right. This house, bought with my own money and reclaimed through my own strength, felt like home in a way nowhere else ever had. As I stood in my garden that evening, surrounded by plants I'd chosen and nurtured, I realized something profound. I'd spent 47 years trying to be the wife Richard wanted, working myself to exhaustion to support his dreams and ambitions. But I'd never asked myself what I wanted. Now I knew. I wanted this quiet evening, this beautiful space. This sense of security that came from knowing everything around me was truly mine. I wanted the freedom to be generous without being taken advantage of, to love without losing myself. I wanted to live the rest of my life on my own terms. If this story moved you, click on the next video that's appearing on the screen now. I'm sure you'll be surprised by this new emotional and heartbreaking story I have right here to tell you.